Thank you for that introduction. Um, I think there are many important lessons to be taken from the COVID-19 pandemic, and that we can take some lessons on ways we could reduce the risk and the severity of future public health crises, and all the dimensions of risk that you spoke of, the risks to human health, the broader social and economic and educational risks or costs. First, let me just emphasize how enormous these costs of the COVID-19 pandemic are, and why it's really imperative that we try to take steps to learn from it and to try to reduce both the likelihood and the burden created by the next time. So a conservative estimate of the global cost of COVID-19 is around $36 trillion. Where does that come from? Well, if we take let's use the IMF estimate of just the short run GDP cost of COVID. They estimated $13.8 trillion. Okay. Now, but some of interestingly, the long run costs are likely to be much larger, or significantly larger than the costs that we've already incurred. And why is that? Well, COVID-19 led to many school closures around the world. In some places, children have been out of school for years. And if you're talking about low or middle income economies, those children may never go back to school. And so based on some evidence from other school disruptions, the World Bank estimates a loss of productivity and future earnings due to COVID-19 of $10 to $17 trillion. So, from slightly under to slightly over the immediate short-run GDP costs. And then, of course, there are the health costs, and it's philosophically obviously very difficult to put a dollar value on a statistical life, but there in health economics, people do this, and again, you get another enormous figure added. And this is just based on the deaths, not even counting the mental health costs or just the human suffering costs. So you very quickly get to a number like $36 trillion. So anything that we can do to try to prevent this from occurring, or to try to reduce the severity if it does occur, or to shorten the time period, is just hugely valuable. And I think there are, and I can be quantitative about that in a bit, as economists tend to want to be.
That's your job.
Let me just first note that there are many different things that we need to do to try to do this. And this ranges from, I'm going to focus primarily on vaccines because that's the issue I've worked on, but I don't mean to neglect the other parts of the problem. Developing treatments more quickly, developing diagnostics, trying to learn more about what non-pharmaceutical interventions, things like masking, social distancing, school closures, which of those are actually effective against the disease, and which ones are less effective and perhaps more costly to society through, as I believe, school closings were, extended school closings. Trying to learn more about that, I think, and learn more quickly the next time is going to be very important. There's other things like surveillance so that we can identify if there are diseases that might be leading to outbreaks and stop things before they spread. There's thinking about how we can better design economic systems to provide support if there is a crisis like this. Thinking about education systems, how can we reduce some of these educational costs or mental health costs of the pandemic? So I won't focus on these because I know less about them, but I do think that these are all very important components. But turning to vaccines, let me note that the estimated chance of a pandemic, obviously this is a matter of some debate, but it's estimated a 2% annual chance. So if you think about this cost of 36 trillion, and you break that down, how much should we expect to be the cost to be every year? Well, it's in the range of $700 billion a year. So that is just the expected costs of this, multiplying that number by 2%. So when you have numbers that big for the cost, some decisions that we might not do otherwise might start to make sense. So, in particular, I'll argue that it makes sense to have a large amount of vaccine manufacturing capacity installed so that if we do get another pandemic, then we can move very quickly from having candidate vaccines to being able to, in parallel, and I think this is something that to some extent the world did well during COVID, to some extent we didn't do enough, is trying to make multiple investments in parallel. So normally, pharmaceutical companies wait until they have some positive evidence on a candidate vaccine before they start producing it in very large scale. And that's because it can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build a plant. And most vaccines actually fail. In a way, we were lucky with COVID and how many succeeded. But you can imagine from a purely commercial point of view, it might seem that it makes sense to wait to see whether the vaccine's actually going to succeed before building the plant at commercial scale or at very large scale. But in this type of pandemic situation, or if there's a risk of that, then the benefits of it's worth taking basically it's worth taking the risks of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a plant that for a vaccine that might not succeed, when the alternative is costs of this magnitude. And that's true. In work we did early in the pandemic, we did our calculations assuming there'd only be about a 5% chance that a typical vaccine would succeed. But we found that despite that, it was completely worthwhile doing this, just because of that 5% chance, plus the possibility that you would accelerate the availability of vaccine. In fact, we recommended that this be done for many vaccines, many candidate vaccines. Now, one effort to do this, and just to make this very concrete, the Operation Warp Speed in the United States basically signed a bunch of contracts to pay for factories to be built early on before it was known whether the vaccines would work. That cost $13 billion, so not a small sum of money in the amounts we normally think about it. But given these tremendous costs of the pandemic, it would have paid for itself if it accelerated vaccination by just 12 hours. So now I'll come back to some issues around Operation Warp Speed and the fact that that was done for the United States and rather than for the world. But I think this calculation suggests that the aim in the future should be to try to make sure that this is available for the whole world, rather than to say let's not make the investments. The investments were very good. There's a question of how do we structure things so that the entire world can benefit from it. I think that's actually it's a much easier challenge going forward when we're thinking about prevention of the next pandemic or mitigating the effects of the next pandemic than it was for COVID. Okay. What caused, we faced many shortages in the case of COVID. There were shortages of just factory capacity. There were also shortages of inputs, things like you need bioreactors to manufacture the vaccine in. You need lipid particles. There are things called adjuvants that go into vaccine. Those were in short supply. Now, in a situation where you have shortages, there are very strong incentives for countries to impose trade restrictions and hoard vaccines. And we saw these trade restrictions imposed by many countries. The United States imposed them, India imposed them. I think we can try to make moral appeals to politicians to not put in those restrictions, but it's very hard to overcome the natural incentives, and some would argue the responsibility of politicians and democratically elected politicians to serve the people who elected them and to prioritize them first, and to try and get vaccines, if there's a shortage, to try to get vaccines to them first. I think a better strategy, rather than hoping that in the next pandemic, political leaders are going to be more globally minded. I think a better strategy is to try to change the incentives that politicians are facing. And the best way to do that is by investing in advance to create sufficient standby production capacity for vaccines and sufficient standby input availability, stockpiles, so that we have sufficient supplies available. And if those are available, then the incentives to impose trade restrictions are much weaker. That sounds very theoretical and very hypothetical, but in fact we saw this with masks, for example, personal protective equipment. Very early in the pandemic, many countries put trade restrictions on export of masks. As soon as supply adjusted, and it was possible to ramp up supply of this much more quickly, the problem stopped, and countries were not keeping these export restrictions on. So I think one lesson is, let's try to get a lot of capacity in line, and that doesn't just mean the factory capacity and the stockpiles of inputs. It also means the human resources, the quality control systems, everything else, and that has a real cost. If you have a lot of workers who are if you have the factories, if you have the workers, and those are on standby, that could cost a few $1 billion a year. But spending a few $1 billion a year when the expected cost, the 2% chance times the cost if we do have another pandemic the size of COVID, that is $700 billion a year. This is an extremely good investment by even the narrowest cost-benefit terms. So one is having the production capacity available. The second thing is better systems for research and development. So there are many, and trying to do some of that R&D now. So there's been discussion of having a universal COVID vaccine, universal coronavirus vaccine that would work against a whole strain of different coronaviruses. If you ask me now, and if the only alternative were either we invest in this or we don't, I would say let's invest in it. We don't know whether that's going to work, but if there's a small chance that it works, this is like a little bit like, do we want a fire department? Well, we don't know if there'll be a fire, and we don't know if our fire department will succeed in fighting the fire if we have a fire. But still, we decide to have fire departments. I think there's a natural tendency to think, well, let's be conservative. Let's not risk wasting any money. But that's not the appropriate way to think about this. These are investments that reduce, they're not going to eliminate, but they reduce these huge risks that we're facing. They're very worthwhile. And I've been a little bit, I've been putting things in very cold economic terms because people may not respond sufficiently to just the health consequences. But even in cold economic terms, these are clearly, it's worth these investments with only a small probability of success. So if I were a government official and had to decide today, do I invest or not, I would certainly invest. Now, but another approach would be to tell companies that it's your decision whether you take the scientific risk of investing, but if you produce something, we're going to pay for it, and then leave that risk with the firms. But of course, you'll need to pay more if you're asking them to take on that risk. rather than funding the costs up front. Either alternative could be pursued here.